Most people do not know this, but for decades the African continent has been the playground of Western subversive activities. With the aid of their military bases set up in African countries, the West has used its superior military intelligence and machinery to spy on the continent and make certain decisions based on the information to further their interests. This is the reason why African leaders like President Traoré and the leaders of the AES decided to dismantle the foreign military bases in their countries. But in an interesting turn of events, President Traoré of Burkina Faso recently apprehended a foreign spy by himself in Burkina Faso. This shows that despite dismantling these bases, Western subversive activities have not ended. But who was the spy and how did Traoré capture him? Let's find out. It would interest you to know that on some occasions, President Traoré personally leads his troops on military operations, so he is not just the kind of leader who gives orders and sits in his office waiting for the order to be carried out. This style of leadership is reported to boost the morale of the soldiers during operations, but it shouldn't be surprising that Traoré personally handles some military operations. If you recall, Traoré is quite skilled and competent. The Burkinabe military leader joined the Burkina Faso army in 2009 after graduating with honors from university. He was promoted to lieutenant in 2014 and assigned to the MINUSMA, a United Nations peacekeeping unit involved in the Mali conflict. 4 years later, he was mentioned as one of the MINUSMA soldiers who showed courage amid major rebel attacks in the Tombouctou region. He later went to Burkina Faso to help in operations against the increasing jihadist insurgency, where he was appointed to captain in 2020. Now, it was during one such military operation led by President Traoré that he caught the foreign spy. According to the reports, the spy had infiltrated a high-risk area in eastern Burkina Faso. This area is quite notorious for insecurity, as armed groups have tried to take over the area. Apparently, the spy had been sent with a clear mission to gather sensitive intelligence that could potentially destabilize Burkina Faso and destroy the ongoing efforts to combat insecurity. However, due to the vigilance of the Burkinabe military, the foreign element was quickly identified and an operation was launched to capture him. President Traoré decided to lead this operation and he was successful. Currently, investigations are still ongoing to determine who this foreign spy is and where he was sent from. The interesting thing is that this is not the first time that the Burkinabe military has caught spies infiltrating the country. Since Traoré made it clear that it doesn't want to have anything to do with France, the authorities in France have been trying hard to cause chaos and destabilize the country. One way they have done this is by sending spies into the country to gather intelligence. But just like how it happened recently, these spies were caught by the Burkinabe military. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to support our channel by liking this video, dropping a comment, and subscribing to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, the first of such subversive activities occurred on December 1st, 2023, when 4 French spies were arrested, charged, and imprisoned in the capital Ouagadougou. According to the Burkinabe military authority, these officials were French secret intelligence agents, but guess what? France denied it, saying that the officials were mere IT support staff. But we shouldn't be surprised, it's what happens. When these Western agents are caught doing questionable activities and the country in question is called to answer for these agents, the agents are disowned, or they come up with a silly excuse as to why they are in the country. However, the Burkinabe authorities were smarter than that and detained these spies. At the time, the disclosure of these arrests put French authorities in an awkward position, leading to attempts by France to stop the spread of the news. It was reported that France reached out to the French media house that reported this news and tried to persuade them from publishing the news. The French Foreign Ministry also tried to download the incident, but regardless of how the French government tries to downplay the incident, it could not change the fact that these French spies have been caught, and they have been in the custody of the Burkinabe authorities. Since then, France has tried every possible way to make the authorities in Burkina Faso release the spies, but it didn't work until December 2024, when the authorities in Morocco stepped into the issue. By then, these spies had been detained for over a year. Interestingly, even though the French authorities tried to deny that they were spies, the head of France's foreign intelligence agency, the DGSE, admitted the truth himself. According to President Traoré, the spies were only released thanks to the good relations with Morocco. Recall that Morocco is one of the African countries that supported Burkina Faso and other coup-led countries at a time when they faced condemnation from the West and ECOWAS. The King of Morocco pledged to give the countries of the Sahel access to global trade through the Atlantic. Now here is the million-dollar question. What were these spies been doing in Burkina Faso? What has the investigation into their activities revealed? According to the investigation, the French spies revealed that there exists an extensive network of French agents across African countries, and their job is to provide aid to rebel groups involved in conflicts across the Sahel region. This is a bombshell. What this simply means is that France has been sending its agents to give support to rebel groups, including jihadists, who have been the major cause of insecurity and conflict in African countries. These agents are not just in Burkina Faso, they spread across the African continent. Obviously, the motive behind this is so that France can have a military presence in that country under the pretext of fighting terrorism. What a scam! Their military presence also ensures that they have access to critical minerals present in abundance in the country. The very idea that a foreign country can manipulate the security situation of the country for its political interests without regard to the effect it would have on the populace is essentially troubling. It's no wonder that despite the number of years spent by French forces in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the insecurity and conflicts persisted in each of these nations. Reports even suggest that the insecurity worsened by a significant margin after French troops settled in the country. If these reports by the French spies are correct, it means foreign military forces such as the French forces and the US forces that are invited to help fight against terrorism might just be responsible for it. This therefore means that African leaders across the continent need to thoroughly investigate the activities of the so-called counter-terrorism efforts by Western militaries in their countries. Of course, we believe the reports of the investigation. Just last week, the world went into an uproar after a US congressman revealed that US aides, under the leadership of former US President Obama and Biden, funded terrorist groups. African countries have been dealing with insecurity for years, resulting in the loss of lives and properties. Yet the people funding these operations are supposedly champions of justice and democracy. If the US can fund these operations, then it cannot be far-fetched to say that France has also supported some of these terrorist groups, especially in the Sahel region. Interestingly, President Traoré has been saying this for some time, but only a few people believe him. But Traoré is right in his assertions, and that is why he has tried to uproot every element of French subversive activities in Burkina Faso. In 2024, for instance, Burkina Faso expelled 3 French diplomats from the country for subversive activities. According to the message sent by the Burkinabe Foreign Ministry to the French embassy, 3 were declared persona non grata and told to leave the country in 48 hours. The 3 diplomats include Gwenaël Habouzi, Hervé Fournier, and Guillaume Ressaca. The word subversive in the dictionary means the act of undermining the authority and power of an already established system. So what the Burkinabe military government means is that these 3 diplomats were engaging in activities that would cause chaos and destroy the government of Burkina Faso. Although the military government did not specify what kind of activities these diplomats engaged in, we can only imagine what they have done. In other words, these 3 diplomats were high-profile spies sent on a mission by the French government to undermine the authority and cause dissent in Burkina Faso. Who knows what they have done? Maybe they have tried to spread false information about Ibrahim Traoré's administration to the people of Burkina Faso, because that is one tactic they have used over and over again to cause dissent in African countries since the time of colonization. Or maybe they have tried to infiltrate the military and incite dissent, which would lead to a coup to overthrow Ibrahim Traoré. Again, this is something that France has done before. The possibilities of what these 3 French diplomats are endless, but fortunately they were caught and have been sent out of the country. Interestingly, Burkina Faso is not the only African country that has revealed how France used its troops and agents network to create and plunge the country into insecurity and afterward pretend to help. Recall that during the 78th United Nations General Assembly, the Foreign Minister of Mali, Abdoulaye Diop, told every leader present in the meeting that they had evidence that France was responsible for creating terrorism in the country. In the presence of every world leader present, including France, Foreign Minister Diop recounted how he sent a letter to the President of the United Nations Security Council detailing French support for terrorist groups. The letter contained more than 50 incidents where Malian airspace was deliberately violated by French aircraft. According to Minister Diop, France used these aircraft to deliver weapons and ammunition to terrorist groups in the Sahel region. France knew that if it had asked permission from the Malian authorities, they would have demanded that the aircraft be inspected, which would lead to the discovery of these weapons. This is why they entered the Malian airspace illegally. The letter further stated that the Malian authorities had evidence that France used this airspace violation to gather intelligence to aid terrorist groups and provide them with arms and ammunition. Unfortunately, the United Nations did not respond to the letter, and neither did it do anything concerning the issue. The Prime Minister of Mali also supports this claim, saying that he has evidence supporting this statement. According to Prime Minister Maiga, French troops established a stronghold in Kidal, a town in northern Mali, and allegedly handed control of the town to a group reported to have a link to terrorists. Maiga alleged that the Malian military was barred from entering this territory controlled by France. However, after kicking out French troops from the country, Mali was able to recover that town thanks to the help given by the Russian military. This action of France in supporting terrorist groups and rebel groups responsible for insecurity in the region, all because they want to maintain their hold on the region, is a shame. Thankfully, the military juntas of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have realized this sham purpose by France and have taken the necessary steps to ensure that they do not fall victim. In Burkina Faso, Captain Traoré has been hard at work in combating the terrorism that France has created and supports. Although the media may say that insecurity has increased since French troops left, the fact is the Burkinabe military has had some resounding success in taking back territories that terrorist groups had previously taken. But the media will not publicize it because they are also in cohorts with the French government, which would use any tactic to ensure that the Traoré administration is undermined. Speaking only of how insecurity has increased and how many more people have been killed since French forces left the country would create the image that it was the French military that was responsible for calming the situation, thereby creating the image that the Burkinabe military is incompetent and not equipped to fight the terrorists on their own. However, the media cannot also deny that research has shown that the insecurity situation was better off before French troops settled in Burkina Faso. Besides that, what do they expect when France is responsible for creating the insecurity in the first place? But France is not the only Western country responsible for creating havoc and destabilization across Africa. As the recent news suggests, the US has also been involved, even more than France. In 2007, the US created the US AFRICOM, even though it already had a military presence in Africa with about 1,700 soldiers in Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. It was former President Bush who began to push US policymakers for a more focused approach toward Africa. In his own words, "In Africa, promise and opportunity sit side by side with disease, war, and desperate poverty. This threatens both a core value of the United States, preserving human dignity, and our strategic priority, combating global terror." Can you imagine the condescending statement? So, in the goodness of their heart, the Bush administration identified Africa as a high priority and recognized that American security depends on partnering with Africans to strengthen fragile and failing states and to bring so-called ungoverned areas under the control of effective democracies. It was against this background that the US AFRICOM was established in 2007, and it was set up primarily to promote the national interest of the United States in Africa. The establishment of the US AFRICOM was resisted by most African countries, including the African Union, which was suspicious about the real reason for the establishment of the organization, and given the fact that the presence of such a military organization undermines the sovereignty of African states. But does the United States government care about such concerns? Of course not. Why is it then that despite the negative reactions and resentment by African leaders towards the establishment of AFRICOM, the organization was still established and has increasingly grown in power as strength? Well, AFRICOM always say that they set up their bases in collaboration and partnership with African countries, but this term partnership is not truly what we know it to be. African partnership with the West has always been paternalistic, imperialist, and geared towards the benefit of the West. It's the same way with AFRICOM. Imagine this scenario: the US comes to an African country and says it wants to set up a military base in its country, but the African country says no. Then the US comes again, but this time it's with a threat, an economic diplomatic threat. If the African country refuses to heed to the US, then they won't have access to the loan they may have been asking the IMF or World Bank to grant them. This is what is happening in the background, but nobody would say it. Indeed, the US uses its influence as the International Monetary Fund's (IMF) largest financial contributor as leverage in its negotiations with African states to ensure their cooperation on matters of security. As scholar Zohra Ahmed has explained, the kinds of international relationships the United States cultivates in support of its wars fall somewhere in a legal gray zone between consent and coercion. And due to the economic constraint and continued dependence on foreign loans to sustain the African economy, the African government would have no choice but to comply with the priorities of the US government. It is devastating that the same country that speaks about human dignity, justice, sovereignty, and human rights is the same one that is trampling on the dignity and sovereignty of another nation just because it has more power. However, this is even the least of what AFRICOM is doing in Africa. Now, even though AFRICOM says it's in partnership with African countries to not even fight war but to prevent it from happening, the operations of the US military are shrouded in secrecy. In most of the missions carried out by the US operatives, African governments are usually not aware of what they do and why they do it. And yet it's called a partnership. Even basic information, like the sweep and scope of deployments by elite US troops and clandestine combat by American commandos on the continent, is mostly unreported across Africa. If you watch our video on US secret biolabs in Africa, you will see how with the aid of the US military, the US has set up hundreds of labs across the African continent which they sometimes use to experiment on the local populace. Why would they keep their operations secret from their African partners if they are not doing something suspicious in the country? So, you see that AFRICOM is beyond promoting the interest of the US, which President Bush said is fighting terrorism before it happens. In fact, if that were true, why are terrorism and insecurity currently widespread in the continent? The United States military came into the continent based on the idea that Africa is not capable of solving its problem. The governments are too weak and the people too dull, right? Now, AFRICOM, whose goal is to prevent war and insecurity, have been in the continent since 2007, conducting secret missions all over the continent. And yet, with all their high-tech grade military equipment, they were not able to prevent terrorism and Islamist jihadists from breaking out in Mali and spreading all across the Sahel region. They can't tell us that they were not aware of the plans of the jihadists with all their high-tech equipment used for spy missions across the African continent. And let's say they were not aware, why couldn't they have eliminated the threat of these terrorists when they just started? It's just obvious that fighting terrorism was just an excuse given to the public as to why the US needed to create AFRICOM. As we said, AFRICOM is solely in Africa to promote American interests, which doesn't have anything to do with combating terrorism. In fact, as the revelations of US aids now come to light, it cannot be far-fetched to say that the US AFRICOM is used to fuel terrorism across the African continent. But this is why African leaders need to follow in the footsteps of President Traoré. They need to wake up and destroy every element of foreign subversive activities, including military bases. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment and share.